Hello, welcome to our weekly chat show on Sheffield Live TV. It'll be on my YouTube channel later as usual. And we've had a series of shows just lately about books, some great books there have been too. And this is the third of that trilogy. And the author of this, Dick Chester, Football and Insider's Job, is with me in the studio. Somebody that I used to collaborate with, as it were, many years ago in this city of Sheffield.
Yeah, many years ago.
Yeah, but it's good to see you, Dick, and looking well.
Thank you, Alan.
And I'm going to ask you a question in a minute based on the fact that you're the last person I would ever have guessed to have written a book about his life in football, because this guy has always shown a taciturn quality, great integrity. You could trust him with your life on telling him something, and he could tell trusted people things, and nothing was ever said. But Football and Insider's Job gives a clue to the title. A man who's worked on the inside of football and has written a memoir that I find highly revealing, having lived through some of those times and reported through some of those times, even explosive at times, and certainly relevant to the game today. Dick Chester's worked in all four divisions of English football: Lincoln City 1971 to 78, Sheffield United 79 to 83, Sheffield Wednesday 83 to 86, and uniquely is the only person to have been secretary, you can call that chief executive in today's money quite comfortably, at both Sheffield clubs. Dick, that's an achievement that you must be quite proud of.
Yeah, very pleased, and never ever did I think that I would ever get into professional football in the first place, because I've got my eyes on refereeing. But once I did, quickly had to get my feet under the desk and start proving myself.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that comes across in the book is the enormity of the role. It's so wide-ranging, but we'll come to stories of murky dealings. I mean, the word murky recurs in the book, and I know that you feel there are lessons for football today to learn from those goings-on, and indeed today's goings-on. Underhand manoeuvres, dodgy dealings, suspicion of brown envelopes. But first of all, before we sort of get into that, you've written a book when I would have said least expected. Why?
I think the answer to that is probably you.
Go on.
If you remember rightly, we had a conversation over during the days of the proposed new European Super League, and in that conversation you asked me my opinion of it, which I expressed to you, and at the same time I said to you that that's not new, because even back in my days there was manoeuvres afoot for the top clubs to break away and, in essence, decimate the structure of the then Football League.
And those manoeuvres are in this book.
Those manoeuvres are in the book.
You were involved in those, or instructed to be involved in those, as Secretary of Sheffield Wednesday. We'll come to Sheffield Wednesday more in part two. I think this is more of a Sheffield United part one, and it takes your career chronologically. A bit of background, by the way, later. Graham Taylor will get a mention because you worked with him at Lincoln City. But at Bramall Lane, you were there in a period of decline, a sort of fall and rise, really. Harry Haslam, Martin Peters, then Ian Porterfield, manager. There was a drop to Division 4, as it was then, in 1981, and the resurgence under Porterfield. At Hillsborough, great success for Sheffield Wednesday under Howard Wilkinson. But let's deal with the Blades first. Harry Haslam, what a character. Why did that not work out?
I think the only person really to answer that would be Harry Haslam himself.
If he was here, sadly
if he was here, but Harry was very much an inside man. He spent most of his time in the office. He didn't get it too involved whatsoever inside in the training. How on earth he managed to pick the side, not having seen what happened in the training sessions, I do not know. He had a very good assistant with Danny Bergara.
Absolutely.
And I think he relied a lot upon Danny Bergara.
Danny Bergara was effectively team manager.
I think in essence probably it was, and Harry probably you would call, in essence, probably an overseer.
And also and he gloried in this, a wheeler dealer. He loved that.
Very much so, yeah.
Whereas Harry Redknapp just recently resents that, but Harry Haslam liked it, didn't he?
He did like it, and my very, very early days of working with Harry after Keith Walker had left and my office was mine, spent many hours reminiscing, or he was reminiscing when I was trying to do some work, about some of his wheeling and dealing.
A real wisecracker. And one of his part of his wheeling dealing didn't involve Sheffield United at all, did it? There was that famous exploration into South America, which ended up with Alex Sabella joining the Blades. Diego Maradona had been a target. And then, according to your book, Harry Haslam operated for Spurs in the signing of Ozzy Ardiles.
Well, again, Alan, I can only recap what Harry, in actual fact, was pleased enough to advise me about. And the story in Argentina was that he'd lined up Diego Maradona. The chairman and the board of directors at Sheffield United couldn't raise the money. But that particular evening, waiting for the decision from the board, Harry said that he was visited by the chief of police. A gun was pointed at him, and he said, "Maradona, no, no." So he quickly went next door and involved the services of Oscar Arque, who was out there as the translator, and the answer came through: no money, and there was no Maradona.
No.
And as a result, the next option was Alex Sabella. But in between all that, whilst they'd been across in Argentina, they had been advised of the availability of Ricky Villa and Ozzy Ardiles, which again, I was told was far too much money for Sheffield United. So Harry contacted a long-lost friend of his in football, and hence the story where they finished up at Tottenham Hotspur.
And he did quite well out of it, according to your book.
So I am told, yes, and in actual fact that was probably the first instance that I had been involved in where it was suggested that if we worked together we could do similar sorts of deals and laugh all the way to the bank.
Were those the words used?
Those were the words that was used, yes.
Right.
And my reply was quite simple: Harry, I'm here to administer the club.
Right.
Sorry, I'm not interested.
You did no laughing all the way to the bank then?
I did no laughing all the way to the bank, and I've not laughed going to the bank since.
Most of us haven't. Reg Breely's another character I've got to come to, because you've had a long association, but just briefly Martin Peters, because when Harry Haslam was sacked, Martin Peters took over, who was in the dressing room already. Yeah. And look, that was a spectacular failure, wasn't it? I mean, I remember those times. Yes,
I think in fairness to Martin, he probably realised that he was he'd stepped down to a level of football which was beyond his international and professional career, and I think he was finding it quite difficult. It was also quite difficult to communicate with, because it was pretty much aloof. His own man. I can't ever remember him coming in and asking me for anything.
Really?
No.
Whereas you operated quite closely with most managers.
I've operated very closely with most managers, yeah.
And Reg Breely, who you've known already, as a guy that figures repeatedly, for good or bad, in this book. You've had a checkered relationship with him, but you still call him a friend.
I do, yes.
Yeah.
Because I think friendship is deeper than anything. He came across because when I first joined, Sheffield United was in such a difficult financial state, I couldn't even be provided with a company car. And Reg Breely, who I'd done some work with on a private basis beforehand, instantly said, "We use one of our cars." So as a consequence of that, I did say to John Haslam, who was then chairman, do you mind if I ask Reg over as a guest? But I won't be able to look after him because my duties don't allow me into the boardroom. And he said, by all means. And he came.
And he became...
And then he came again, unbeknown to me, until I left him a ticket.
He put an awful lot of money into Sheffield United and got them out the cart, didn't he, Reg?
Before Reg took over, he asked me if I would draw up a plan for him as to what I could see the future for Sheffield United Football Club, which I duly did, part of which was the £1 million debt that was accountable to the NatWest Bank. And I said, that's got to be released somehow or other, and it can't, because of the strength of the balance sheet, it can't be done in loans because we're up to our neck in loans, so it had to be done somewhere else. And the recommendation was to issue £1 million share launch, bearing in mind that that had to be approved by the board, which it was, on a joint and several basis. So if the shareholders who were given the first options didn't take up the shares, then the directors would pick up and buy up the rest.
And Reg did.
The shareholders didn't take up much of their options, a bit less than 200,000 out of the £1 million. It came to the directors to top up, and the only one director that was prepared to honour it was Reg Breely. And in all sincerity, I think that if he hadn't have propped up the club to that amount, I'm not so sure that Sheffield United would have continued, because the position was very serious, and there was nobody else within the city of Sheffield that appeared to be interested in joining the board with that level of finance. So I think he was a saviour of the club. I know he went on, and supporters had different views of him at later date, but he was a saviour of the club.
Yeah, there were cross swords, but you know, for want of a better analogy, the blades are better off not thinking of the cross swords and thinking of the cheques that he signed. And he was a man of action. He appointed probably the best man for the job, in my opinion, looking back. And I'd seen Rotherham storm to the third division championship, as it was then, under Ian Porterfield. And there was a story of remarkable success. Now, you must have had, you've worked with different characters as managers. You must have got on well with some and not so well with others. How did you get on with Ian?
Ian was okay to work with, unless his temper was playing him up, which was quite frequently, in which case then just stand your distance and be prepared. As a manager, very successful, very lucky indeed, because whatever player he wanted, irrespective of when, the cheque was there for him to sign them. And I can't recollect him recommending the signing of any player that didn't go ahead.
Well, we're talking Keith Edwards, Colin Morris, and other real quality signings. And
yeah. Well, I've talked about the Keith Edwards signing in the book, and also the Colin Edwards.
You found Ian Porterfield, according to the book, quite demanding, but you still respected what he was doing as a manager.
He had a job to do. A manager's job, and particularly back in those days, was very much a pressurised position. I always thought that Ian's unfortunate accident previously might have had some effect upon his mental state. I don't mean it was mental, but it blew very, very hot and very cold, and it didn't take very much at all to take him from one to the other. Flicked. And if he came into the office with a red face, be prepared.
Right, you took that as the warning sign.
Warning sign.
Right, okay, well, that's interesting. Did you have where do you measure other relationships with managers that you've had compared to that one?
I've got on well with all of the managers, and it wouldn't be top of my list.
Right. But in terms of the success he had on the field, he would be, wouldn't he?
In terms of the success he had on the field, very much so.
Yeah. Well, there's a quote from your book which I made a particular note of, where Dick is, I mean, and this is relevant to today really. He says there's a culture of greed and sharp practice in football that must change. And we're talking of events 40 years ago here. Is there any sign that some events that we're going to come to in a moment 40 years ago are not happening now, do you think?
No, I think a lot what was happening 40 years ago probably still exists. I think there's, right. I think the one thing which the outsider probably doesn't realise is that there can be all sorts of scrutinies, protection of expenses, etc., throughout the business to try and maintain a level balance sheet until it comes to players. When it comes to players, then it's a different kettle of fish, and they go ahead, and money doesn't seem to come into it. You need players because in actual fact, that's what the football club's about.
Yeah.
And from my point of view and from my workings, when the team's successful, your job is demanding. When the team isn't successful, your job is even more demanding. More so.
Yeah. Well, you've got instances in the book here, and as I say, we're specifically looking at Sheffield United in part one, where you were suspicious of certain activities and payments to players. More than suspicious, I think it's fair to say.
More than suspicious, yes. The real situation that set alarm bells ringing was sat in my office one day, and two players who I'll not name knocked on my door, came in and said, has an envelope been left for us? And I said, don't know what you mean. Well, there was going to be an envelope left here for us to pick up today. I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. And the players left. As I was going out, the then assistant manager, John McSeveny, said, what are you doing talking to the players? Does the manager know? I said, I don't know. What are they after? And when I told him, he said, I'll join the list then, because there's a lot of them about.
Right.
And at that point, to protect the club and myself, I put in writing my concerns to the chairman.
Do you know what happened from that point?
From that point onwards, yes, I do know what happened, because after that, I was excluded from any discussions where the player was present with the manager. My duties were solely to prepare the paperwork and the signing documentation and leave with the manager and invariably the chairman, who came across and completed the deal.
So you were distanced from all that, but I know one thing that you did say to me in conversation was that you've never saw a brown envelope in all your
I never ever saw a brown envelope, and I never ever saw any sort of cash whatsoever changing hands.
Which is not to say that it didn't.
I think the proof of the pudding from the comments that was passed by the assistant manager in the corridors of Bramall Lane answered it all.
Intrigue as well politically in the boardroom. Derek Dooley has a place in Sheffield football at both clubs that is sacrosanct, I think is a fair word to say, after his great service not only as a rampaging record goal scorer, but he's brought the two sides of Sheffield together, and he's got total respect from both Wednesday and United. What will shock people, what shocked me reading this book, was that there had been a move during your time at Sheffield United to sack Derek Dooley.
Yes. That was that was the message I was given
By
by the chairman, Reg Breely. If you remember, we just mentioned about the document that I prepared giving Reg the advice of what needed to be done to turn around the affairs of Sheffield United, which he accepted. And following that, he did acknowledge to me that when the opportunity arose to appoint a paid director, because at that time there was no paid directors, then that honour would be fallen to me. On this particular occasion, Reg came over to the Bramall Lane on the Friday to check the preparation of the agenda, which I normally went through with him in preparation for the Monday's board meeting, and it met with his approval. We carried on doing whatever calls he had to do within the club, and on leaving, he knocked on the door and said, "What are you up to at the weekend?" And I said, "I don't know really at the moment." He says, "Well, I've got a very, very difficult Sunday luncheon to deal with." I said, "Oh." He said, "I've invited Derek and Sylvia," that's Derek's wife, over because I'm going to sack him. And we had appointed Andy Dakin previously to assume the responsibility that Derek had. And I thought to myself, "Reg, you need to be careful, because if you're going to tell Derek that," Derek was one of my best friends in football. He got a temper as well, and I thought, you prepare yourself, because he's not going to sit down and laugh that off. Come the Monday of the board meeting, everything's prepared, and before the actual start of the meeting, Reg asked if he could deal with one item which wasn't on the agenda, and the directors approved, and he went on to request approval for the appointment of Derek Dooley as the first paid director.
Which was supposed to be going to you.
Which was promised to me. I finished the board meeting, tidied the boardroom up, went down to my office, cleared my desk, went home, rang Reg Breely and asked him if I could go over and see him at his Sleaford office the following day, and advise him that that was my last day at work. And it's funny, really, because Derek and I, as I said, were very good friends. We travelled all over the country together, got on very well as a foursome, and neither of us had mentioned that Derek had been promised, which, according to Derek's autobiography, which I read several years after, it covers that in his autobiography, and Reg at the same time had offered me it.
Promised it to you.
So it was...
I'm really surprised that your friendship with Reg Breely survived that.
When I was at Lincoln City, my marriage broke up, and I was struggling to find a house because I hadn't. I mean, we're not talking about mega money, but it was decent money in those days. And Reg Breely came in and bought some shares for me and sold them. You could buy shares in those days and sell them within 28 days, not have to pay for them.
So he helped you.
So he bought me some shares and sold them, gave me the profits, and I respected him from that point onwards, because when I was struggling, he helped me.
He's still in credit in that relationship even to this day.
Yeah, in actual
it's
fact.
Interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of revelations in here, and as I say, you know, people who worked through that time, as I did journalistically quite early in my career, quite surprised by some of what Dick reveals in this book, including, and we won't go into this here, but you better buy the book for all the details on these stories, including an attempt by the Yorkshire Bank to buy Sheffield United during Dick's time there. He left Sheffield United, and where would he end up? You couldn't really script this. Across the city at Sheffield Wednesday, and we'll have more on that. Real focus on Dick Chester's life at Hillsborough. Some interesting things there as well. After this short break, we'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Oh, I got